Carousel CSS. Now that we have the HTML we need for our list of quotes, let's add the CSS to make it look a bit more like a carousel. In this lesson, we'll be styling the list of quotes we built using HTML, as well as the progress indicator pips that we added. We'll also think about the states of the carousel and how we might be able to use CSS transitions to animate between these states. To get started, open the Module 4 code file and look for folder 02 Start. A completed version of this lesson's code is in the folder 02 End. So far, we've created a couple of unstyled lists. Let's transform this boring list into something more interesting. In the CSS folder, you'll find an empty file called carousel.css. This is where we'll add the styles. First up, we'll need to style our container. We add the style block for the quotes carousel container. This simply gives the container a height, width, and places it in the center of the screen using an auto value for the left and right margins. Lastly, we set the position to relative so that we can perform absolute positioning within this container. Inside this container, we have two lists, one for the quotes and one for the pips. We begin with the quotes. This is a container for each of the quotes, so we're giving it a height and width as well as its own position value so that we can use absolute positioning. Next, we'll style the quotes. Firstly, we'd like to let people click or tap on the previous and next quotes to prompt the carousel to move that direction. We can make this visible using the cursor property. This will make the mouse cursor show a hand as if it's a link. We can then give the quote some margin and padding, set the opacity to 0 so that the quotes are invisible by default, and set the list style to none. Next, we want to think about how we're positioning and moving these around. Ideally, it would make sense for the quotes to sit off to the right of our carousel and then animate in from the right. We also want them to be centered vertically. To do this, we'll use position to set the top and right to 50%. We can then use a transform to push the quote over to the right. I'm using calc here to push it to the edge of the container 100%, then a further 12m so that it's beginning outside the container. I'm then pulling it up by applying -50% to the y-axis transform so that it'll be centered vertically. What we're doing here is placing the element close to the middle using absolute positioning, but then using a transform to move it across to the right. When we're setting up the current and other states, this should also be easier to manage as the quotes all begin somewhere around the middle before any transform is applied. Lastly, we have the transition. For this, we're transitioning the transform property over 1.5 seconds and using a bouncy cubic base year timing function. We then add a second transition property, opacity, as that will be animating also. This time a little quicker at 0.5 seconds, and we'll add a delay of 0.6 seconds with a basic ease out timing function. With the containers and the quotes styled, that leaves the images. For the images, we'll make sure the background fits by using the cover background size. We'll make them circular using a border radius of 50% and add a little box shadow to make it look like the image is showing through a cutout in the page. We also give the images a height and width. and position them at the top of the quote container. So far, we've added a lot of styling, but since the quotes have an opacity of 0, there's not much to see. Let's change that by styling the previous, current, and next quotes. The visible quotes we want will have one of these 3 states. We add them to our CSS like so. Starting with the previous quote, we'd like that to be visible but somewhat faded out and sit on the left side of the screen. We'd also like it to be a little smaller than the main current quote. We can do this by applying an opacity and then applying a transform to pull it left by 150%, keeping the same y-axis transform and applying a scale of 0.8. The current quote is to be front and center. For this, we'll set the cursor back to default so that it doesn't behave like a link. We'll give it an opacity of 1 and apply a transform to put it properly centered in the container. This is because the top and left values we set earlier only apply to the top left corner of the element, so this transform puts it back in the right place. Next, we want the next quote to be over on the right-hand side. As with the previous quote, we give it an opacity of 0.5, and we'll use a transform to push it across to the right and scale it down. Lastly, we'll add one more style that will become useful later. If we think about the way our animations are going to flow, the quotes are going to animate in from the right, but then when a previous quote is removed, it'll try to go back across to the right also. This will look odd. To fix this, we'll have a special state called left, which will position the quote over to the left. We'll be able to use this to make sure quotes that are vanishing on the left side continue the correct direction. Here we pull the quote to the left by a calculated -150%, -12m, to make sure it's well over there on the left. Because we don't specify any opacity here, it'll revert to being invisible. Let's check how this is looking. Alright, we're nearly there. Let's finish up by adding some styles for the progress indicator and the pips within it. We want the pips to be visible at the bottom of the carousel, which we can do with absolute positioning. Using text align set to center will make sure they're in the middle of the screen. Next up, we're styling the UL by getting rid of any margin and padding and list styles. Next, we style the pips themselves. For this design, we'll make the pips grey circles, which when hovered over will show the hand cursor. We'll place them in line, 20 pixels in size, with a little margin between each. We'll then use a transform to scale them down to half their original size. This will be useful for a hover effect in which they grow on hover. To help with this, I'll add a transition. In this case, the transition will apply to all properties, a duration of 0.8 seconds, and the exponential ease out timing function. We then add some styles for the states. For the previous and next states, we set the background to a lighter color and scale them up slightly to 0.6. Then we highlight the current item by making its background white and scaling it slightly larger to 0.7. We also set the cursor to default, as clicking this won't do anything. Lastly, we'd like to create a hover effect where the pip scales up on hover. For this, we want any pip to have the hover effect apart from the current one, and we can do this using the not pseudo-selector. What this says is, for each pip that does not have the current class, on hover we should apply the transform to scale the pip up to full size. Checking in the browser, we can see the layout taking shape. When we hover over the previous and next quotes, the mouse cursor turns to a pointer. Similarly, hovering over any of the pips other than the current one causes the hover effect. In this lesson, we built the layout for what will be an animated carousel of quotes. We set out the styles for the carousel, as well as the styles for each state of the highlighted quotes, and added transforms to create animation between these states. In the end, we only needed 2 transitions. We also made use of the not selector when adding a hover effect. Next, we'll begin building the JavaScript needed to power this carousel. There will be quite a few moving parts to this, so in the next lesson, we'll plan and build the basic structure of our JavaScript before getting into the finished code.